Hello, and welcome to Most Writers Are Fans, the podcast that explores the intersection between writing and fandom. My name is Terry Bartley, and I'm your host. So today's a pretty exciting episode. I got to talk to Chloe Spencer. She is a monster romance author. She's written a number of things. She sort of identifies as author, broadly speaking, but the things that she's released thus far has been sort of like in the monster romance realm. And it was a really interesting conversation. We talked about the idea of kind of like exploring things like mental health and other sort of like struggles, but through the lens of like monsters and like horror creatures and like broadly speaking, like sort of like fictional creatures and how we have like this perception of like the things that they struggle with. So make sure you stay tuned for that. So I talked about this before a little bit on the podcast. I'm a high school English teacher, and today I want to talk a little bit about the idea of sort of like having a day job that complements what you do to some extent. Just because like I'm thinking about it because school is going to be back in session in a week or two. And I just have, I'm going to start working a day job again. And I'm not going to be a writer full time. I'm going to be a writer slash teacher and, all the other slashes that I have in my life. Whenever you are sort of like a indie creative that's sort of like your own team. Whenever you do this, like the truth is, like you have to have a day job, right? Like there's very few people who are indie creatives now that are full-time paying for their life with their art. Like that's just the reality of it. And it's sort of upsetting. I'm thinking about this a lot, not just because school's starting back, but also because I'm a fan of Felicia Day. Felicia Day was this, I like to think of her as kind of like a patron saint of indie creatives because she started this web show called The Guild a number of years ago, back in the very early days of YouTube. It was sort of like a scripted comedy thing. And I interviewed her sort of early on. It was whenever the second season was premiering. I did an interview with her on another podcast that I had. And something that I mentioned, and it was one of those like well-meaning fan things, which is like, she did a lot of like national commercials at the time. And I said something to her along the lines of like, how do you feel about like doing those? Because, like for me as a fan, like it's sort of frustrating to see somebody that I think is so talented and deserves so much acclaim, like doing these like commercials. Like it seems like you really are like more than a commercial actor. Like you just are, and you deserve to kind of like have more opportunities. And she said that like she's so grateful for those commercials because she uses them to pay for her art. Like she gets to use the money from those commercials to not only pay for her lifestyle, but then to also fund like the guild and the things that she was producing actively. And I think of that a lot, like, because she's been doing commercials again recently. She recently did an audio podcast, audio drama kind of thing called Third Eye on Amazon. It's like on Audible. So check that out. It's really good. It was really fun listen. But I've noticed that she's been doing national commercials again. She was in a commercial recently that I saw. And I didn't have that reaction that I used to have, which was like, oh man, why is Felicia Day doing commercials? I had that reaction that was like, yeah, Felicia Day, like, get that money. Like, you deserve this. Like, go get it. I'm so proud of you that you're able to sort of, like, pay for these things because now I'm on the other side of it, Like, now I'm not just somebody that's a fan of her work. I'm somebody that's, like, trying to make it in this business myself, like, through my books and through my podcast. And I'm so grateful that my job as a teacher, like, first of all, I get the summers off, so I get this time that I can sort of dedicate to my art that I wouldn't have in literally any other job. It also pays me well enough, not well, I'm not going to pretend like teachers get paid well, but as somebody that's been working a lot of freelance jobs and stuff, it pays me well enough that I can sort of like survive, but then also throw a lot of money at all of this stuff so that I can kind of give it a go and see what comes of it. So I think it's just something to think about because we think of art as something that like feeds us. And like, that's absolutely true for me. Like if I didn't do the podcast, if I didn't write, if I didn't like explore other creative avenues, I would very much be like starved. Like my soul would be starved, like that's just the truth of it. That's what the life of an artist is. You need to find a job that you can sort of like live with, and not just live with, but like be okay with. And I'm not saying it's easy. It's not. It took me many, many, many years to find a job that sort of like allowed for that for me. And I'm still not 100% this is like where I want to be forever, but it is where I am now, and I'm sort of comfortable. And I like that, as somebody that's trying to do this thing. So I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit about that because I think that we don't talk about it enough in this space. I think that a lot of times we talk about the art and the promotion and all the ins and outs of that. and we don't talk about like how we actually like pay our bills. I've heard a lot of people talk about like mental health and self-care is kind of like filling your own cup. And for me, like this, like interviewing people that am like minded with, and writing books and having people tell me how much they love my books, which has been wildly grateful for all of that. That's something that sort of like fills my cup. Don't feel like you have to kill yourself. Don't feel like you have to sacrifice living like an okay, not even comfortable, but just like fine life. Find a little bit of time to feed your soul, and then find the time to pay your bills and let yourself do both of those things. All right, so just wanted to throw that out there. I think it's something that's important for us to talk about as creatives and not sort of like stigmatize the way that we often do, which is like, why do you have a day job, or you're not serious if you have a day job? Like, sure, of course you're serious. You're doing it actively, so you're serious. So, just sort of like think about that. Think about if your job fits that description. If it doesn't, maybe try to find another job that might fit that description. And stay tuned because we have a fun interview coming up with Chloe Spencer. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Movies Writers Fans. I'm joined now with Chloe Spencer. She's an indie author and game developer, and we're going to be talking about how she got into all of this stuff. So what is your sort of like earliest memories of writing or creating or storytelling, or however you want to define that?
That is such a good question. My earliest memory of writing, I think, is when I was a little kid and I wanted to. I thought that newspapers were really cool for some reason. I don't know how I got stuck on that. But one day I took a bunch of printer paper out of my parents' printer, and this was back in like the early 2000s. So printer paper was considered, I guess, expensive, or maybe in my family it was just considered expensive back then, but I ended up scribbling on it, like halfway writing some stories and like scribbling on it, and just like pretending to come up with a newspaper basically. And when I presented it to my parents, they were like really upset that I wasted so much paper. So they actually, my dad, what he actually did, it was a terrible newspaper. Like most of it was scribbles, and then like the other part, which were stories, were like two or three sentences. It was absolutely a waste of paper. It was like 20 pages that I had wasted. I would be mad as well. But what my dad did is that he sat me down in front of the computer and then taught me how to use Microsoft Word. And so then I was able to type and start learning how to write stories. And I was probably maybe like 9 or 10 when I started typing stories. And so that's kind of how I got started with writing, and it was just a really fun pastime for me. um I just had a really good time. I had a really good time with writing and learning how to type and things like that. I still have some of those stories, actually.
Yeah, so that's really cool that you had such supportive parents so early on that kind of like helped take you down this path. So then something happens with people like us, right? Where we're like, I'm not just happy with just writing, but people need to read the thing that I'm writing, or people need to experience the stories that I'm telling. When did that switch sort of like get flipped in your head, where you were like, oh, I should like really do this?
So when I got into the um idea that people needed to experience my work, I actually got the opportunity to kind of read short stories in front of like the classroom a couple times when I was a kid. So that's kind of where I got into the habit of learning to read. And I also used to write comics. I did that also in like my early 20s for like a while, where I would write and draw comics in like notebooks, and I would pass them to my friends at lunch, and we would all like read them, and we would have like a good time reading them and like speculating where we thought the story was going to go. So I got really comfortable with the idea of sharing my work. I was very precious about it. I was still very like kind of scared to share my work, but I remember loving like being able to interact with people, talk with people, kind of see where stories were going and like bounce ideas off of people. So I think that that's where I got the idea to share like my earlier works. And then I think when it came to getting older, like I developed my writing voice a little bit more. I developed my style a little bit more. I really honed in on things that I wanted to write about. And so then from there, I kind of just I wrote about things that I think my teen self would have really resonated with. And I wanted to kind of put that into the world to see if it could be helpful to someone or like resonate with someone else.
Yeah, and do you remember like what like story or book that was, like that first one that really like that you really put out there that you really wanted to like push?
Yeah, the first like I didn't do much to really promote like any anthologies that I was a part of, or like short stories that were released with that. But the first book where I was like, this is going to resonate with someone, this is going to be really important to someone, was Monstersona. And so that was my YA sci-fi horror novel that published, gosh, it published like a year ago now. And it was definitely, it was something that kind of reflected on my experiences in high school with going through losing someone who was very who I was close to, or someone who was very important to me, and reflecting on that grief that I experienced during that time, as well as like it's also kind of a novel that comments a lot on bodily autonomy and things like that, and so that's kind of this book where I was like, this tackles a lot of different subjects and this would be helpful to someone. So that's kind of the first piece out there that I was like, I want to publish this wide scale, and I want to try to get this out there to as many voices as I can.
And talk me through sort of like the decision process of like the trad versus indie route that we all kind of have to make as authors for you.
Yeah, so for me, when I wanted to be I guess I am considered trad. It's weird when you work with like smaller presses because in some ways you are considered
You are trad.
trad pub, and then in other ways you're not. So I work with, yeah, trad technically, yeah. And so I knew I wanted to get like I just I don't I admire self-published authors so much, and publishers that work with and authors that work with like smaller publishers and things like that. I had some really good experiences with publishing some novellas with JMS books. They're a really great like queer owned press, but the thing with small presses is that they're very limited in terms of their ability to like promote or advertise, because generally, at least with JMS books, they publish a lot of different writers, so they've got a lot of different books that are coming out each and every single month. And I wanted, I guess, the thing that made me want to switch from self-published to published was I just wanted something that was a little bit more. I wanted a little bit more of a tailored experience, and I wanted somebody that was going to be able to invest a little more effort into advertising and things like that than I would be able to. And I wanted to try to work with someone who would be able to kind of guide me every step of the way. And so I went looking for like a bunch of different agents. I submitted to a bunch of different agents. I got a lot of full requests, but I was rejected. I was rejected repeatedly. I tried to apply to like some very like notable indie presses, and tried to get my manuscript out there that way. So again, kind of the same issue. I would get a couple full requests, but then would end up being rejected. And so I think that querying Monstersona, that entire process took about 2 years, where I was applying to like these kind of nicer indie presses, and I was also trying to apply to these agents, and I couldn't get my foot in the door. And it was like one day I was scrolling through Amazon, and what I like to do on Amazon is I'd like to look at something to see who was the publisher of this particular book, to try to figure out, okay, like, is this the kind of route that I would want to go? Is this the kind of hands-on experience that I would want to have, just from looking at like how they handle covers and promotion and things like that. And I happened to come across a copy of The Alpha's Son, which is the first book that Tiny Ghost Press ever released. And I had never heard of Tiny Ghost Press. I was looking through like the webpage for The Alpha's Son, and I was like, wow, this is like a really well done cover. This looks really nice. I looked up like their socials and things like that, and saw how active and engaged they were, and they invested a lot of effort in promoting their writers. And that's kind of that they were kind of like my last hope. Otherwise, I was going to put this manuscript on a shelf and just like not touch it. And so I submitted to Tiny Ghost, and the rest is history. Josh, who's the publisher, he loved it, and we went and we published the book, and it's out in the world today.
Yeah, I kind of feel like as the years have gone by, like being traditionally published or self-published or indie press or whatever, it's become more of like a choice that an author makes, right? Like it's less about like the quality of the book and it's more about like what do you want to, how much control do you want as an author? How much work do you want to commit to as an author? Because as a self-published author, I can tell you, lot of work, lot of extra work, as a self-pub author, and and I think there's just something about like I feel like I did it primarily because of the whole rejection thing that you talked about. Because God knows we don't need more rejection in life. It's a lot to deal with. But even if because I think that the like contradiction that you have to live with as a creative putting yourself out there, so you have to know that you're good, right? Like you have to know that like in your heart. Otherwise, like why are you doing this? But then being told over and over and over again by agents or publishers or whatever that you're not good enough, even if that's not what they're saying, that's what you're hearing, right, in your head, and it's hard to kind of like fight that. And so that's sort of like why I chose a self pub rock, just because it's like I just want to get it out there, I just want to do it. But also, I think that
Yeah,
but also like it kind of fits me. Like
yeah,
I feel
that's
like I'm sort of a self starter.
definitely
I like it.
um,
Go ahead.
that's definitely I can understand why you would want to like get out there with self-publishing and everything. I just know that I know like the work that a lot of self published authors like put in, and it tends to be very like I'm friends with like one author who's Isabel is Bell. She writes like Honey Bloods. She's written that series as well as she's written Zombabe, and she invests so much work and like so much effort to like thing, and
And
I
money.
just don't think I have the talent to be a self published author.
Yeah, it's no, it's a commitment. Like it's a lot, and it's I think that it's like I think that it fits. It just so happens to have fit me. Like I made the choice, and I just lucked into the fact that it kind of fits me because I'm somebody that likes to kind of like get my hands in and do a lot of the like have control over
Mhm.
everything. Like I'm like good at that, and I like delegating. But also like what you said about like wanting somebody that can spend more time marketing. I think that's something that I've learned about being an indie creative because I've done this for a couple of years now. You really do just need to bring people in eventually. Like I just hired a guy to edit my podcast because it's just so overwhelming to do everything. And also like you're constantly thinking about like if I'm spending my
Yes.
time doing this, like should I be spending my time doing this other thing that I need to do? Like where is my time best spent? And it really is a thing that I think you have to sort of like slowly figure out for yourself like what is that for you? Have you sort of experienced that?
Yeah, I would say that like definitely the editing part of things. I don't have an editor's eye. So that's one thing. I also think like I did used to like do like little tiny like self-published covers and things like that, but you have to like understand how you have to understand how illustration works for book covers, and I never invested like any effort into figuring that out. So there were like some projects that I self-published where I maybe like drew the cover myself because like I did comics for a long time, and I would end up putting out this cover that was kind of like, okay, this is not like a polished piece of work, and that's something that I was just like, I don't want to deal with this. I don't want to have to deal with this in like my day to day work. I'm the type of person that I just kind of want to sit down and I want to focus on writing, and I do like being on social media to interact with readers, but I get drained from it really, really fast. Honestly, if I didn't have to be on social media, I for like promoting writing and connecting with readers, I don't know if I would be. It makes it worth it to be able to connect like bookstagrammers and things like that, but I get tired really fast. I run out of ideas really fast. I'll post pictures of my cats like on repeat because that's all I know how to do.
Well, and I feel like it's easy to get into that side of it, like the marketing side of it, and then like look around and realize, hey, I've not written in like 3 weeks. Like I didn't I want to write when I
Yes.
started this? Like
Yes, like that. The thing with my friend is Bell. She posts like TikToks every single day. She keeps up with all the trends, and I'm like, I don't know how you do that. It's funny because I write really fast. I write really fast, and so I put out work really fast, and a lot of people will tell me that they don't understand how I'm doing it. But I'll look at someone who has a really strong social media presence, and I'm like, I don't know how you have the time to do that.
Yeah.
I cannot keep up with like TikTok. I can't keep up with Instagram.
Well, and two, I think that it's what I always tell people, and like other people have said this on this podcast too. Like, promotion is about what do you like doing, like what do you want to do to promote, and how can you keep doing that? Because I think that a lot of times we think we're supposed to do certain things. When you're doing what you're supposed to do, but you don't want to do it, you're not gonna follow through. Like ultimately, or it's gonna feel like work, which isn't good either. You know.
Right, yeah. It's so hard to kind of balance this like need to promote yourself and then also just avoid burnout, because this is the social media is the thing that like leads me to burnout the closest, where it's like, okay, I filmed like 5 TikToks today and I just want to take off my makeup and like lay on my bed for a little bit with like my cat on my lap or something. But I'm trying to make sure that like I have enough that can be scheduled. I'm trying to also like make sure that I upload things at a certain time of day. Like for example, I know that you should like be posting things during like the morning and evening commutes as well as like lunchtime, because that's when people are going to be on their phones. So then that's when I have to be on my phone and make sure that I'm posting things within a timely manner. Yeah, that I think is where I get like really stuck and like really frustrated. I think.
So just so we can touch on a little bit before we move on, so in addition to being an author, you also do a lot of video game development. Is this a thing that you sort of like always done on the side? Is this a thing that you've sort of like recently added? Like when did you sort of get the video game bug?
I got the video game bug actually when I think I was working with Kotaku out in New York City. That was the internship that I had right out of college. I started working as like a video game reporter. So I reported on like news and different things happening in the industry. And originally I went into like working at Kotaku thinking that I was going to be writing things more so related to like YouTubers, because I was so big into YouTube back then. I watched YouTube just like every single day religiously, like would watch Jacksepticeye, Markiplier, another YouTuber called Cub Scouts. Like those were the 3 that I would circulate around. But then I ended up actually getting assigned like other stories. And when I was looking for like other story beats, I kind of fell into like indie games. And I got to know like a lot of visual novel developers. I got to see some very cool games that were posted on like in development on Reddit, on itch.io, and that's kind of where I fell into. I'd always like played video games. I've always loved video games. But that's kind of where I got into this mindset where I was like, okay, maybe like I could make a game. Maybe I could do that. And I realized that like there's a lot of times there's a lot of free softwares that are available. There's a lot of like tutorials that are available that were free and really accessible. And this is my cat Kiwi. And I also noticed that like there's certain kinds of game development software that they run specials on at different times of the year. So that's when I ended up getting RPG Maker. And RPG Maker, like, let me just say, this is not this is not a very robust engine to build a game in. It will break, and it will break for reasons that you do not understand. It just breaks. It just does that. It's not like a very polished, I think, engine like Unreal 4 or Unity, where you can do like a lot more things. Like RPG Maker can get very finicky, but I think it was a really great training ground to get into games, and it was really easy to understand how to program a game because it's all just using RPG Maker, I believe, just uses JavaScript. There's a newer version of it where it can export to Unity and you can get code for that there, but I am less versed in that. And so when I got RPG Maker, I thought about like all these things that all the at the time I was making like a lot of comics. I was circulating between like 5 different series, and I was kind of like, well, maybe I should make a video game to kind of promote like the comics that I'm working on. Maybe make something that's a little more interactive. Like maybe that could be a fun opportunity. And then I ended up working more on that game than I ever did the comics. And I ended up kind of learning a lot about programming, about how to design artwork, about how to do some sound design and things like that. And I would say that my games are pretty rough around the edges. I mean, they kind of have to be, since I'm kind of like a little renegade, kind of learning how to do things on my own. But I think that they were a valuable like way for me to kind of work on writing, to understand like character emotions and how characters progress through a story, to understand the different ways that like narratives can branch off as well. I think before I entered video games, I was the type of video game development. I was the type of writer that was very precious about all of my words, about how things were structured in the story, about how characters would be, about what certain events would take place. And I was very resistant to change. But when you work on video games, you have to kind of be accepting of change. And I learned that even more so when I went to film school too.
Yeah, that's great. And I will say one of my favorite things as an indie creative is to come up with an idea for a project to promote another project that is far more work than the original project was. Like
Yeah.
it's so funny that our brains do that, and it's like, why did I do this to myself? But then you still get a lot out of making the other project, and it's a lot of fun. So it's like, oh well.
Yeah, it was so fun. And the thing is that like there's not a lot of independent. This was like before, I think, Last of Us 2 had come out, where Ellie is the one of a major character of Last of Us. She's like the protagonist of Last of Us 2. This was before that character had been had like general audiences, I guess, knew that like she was a lesbian. And there were just not like a lot of interactive stories that were out back then, where it was like an RPG and there were queer characters like at the forefront of the game. There just weren't that many stories like that. There's a lot of visual novels, and there historically has always been like a lot of visual novels that have been very very queer. Like that is like a wonderful resource for like gay representation in games and things like that. But what I wanted to do is I wanted to make like an RPG, because I was like, I can only think of really like Life is Strange, at least back at that time, which I think was in like 2017. Like Life is Strange, and then I think Celeste, where the main character is a trans woman. But I don't think we learned that Celeste was canonically a trans woman until the main character of Celeste was a trans woman until like a long time after the game had been out. So I just wanted something straight from the get go. Like, these characters are queer, they're navigating queerness, things like that. Yeah. And yeah, it is funny how it worked out, how I just ended up making more work for myself than I needed to. But
I feel like you have a good point because I feel like, I think the self publishing has become so much easier over the years. And it's sort of at the place now where we're really seeing, like within the past few years, we've seen a lot of really good self published books come out. Like we're at the place where, like, finally it's easier for people to like do it. But I feel like indie game development has been
I
making
think I might
quality,
have lost
like,
you for
that's
a
where
second.
storytelling in games have been for, I don't know, the past like 10 years or so, has been a lot of really great indie games. Like, think like Undertale, Life is Strange, like all these games have been like in the indie space, and they've been like huge hits.
Yes, yes. And the thing with like the indie games too is that they tend to explore different types of narratives and different types of stories that you just aren't going to get out of a AAA studio. A AAA studio game, I actually find them kind of like boring in comparison, because I think that they're just kind of, a lot of them is about the bells and whistles. And I really like seeing what can this one particular person do with like a limited set of resources, with a limited amount of time. Like, what kind of story is it that they can create with those kind of like building blocks of game development. And I think that that's where like these really wonderful, like beautiful games kind of come to light that we just would have never thought about before. And that I think is what's always going to be exciting about that space.
Well, and two, like, I think that just by the definition of what a AAA game is versus what an indie game is, like, it's gonna be more personal. The story's gonna be more personal to the creator because there's less cooks in the kitchen. So like, think about it, something like Firewatch compared to something
Yes.
like, I don't know, Skyrim. Like it's gonna feel like two very different experiences, and I think that that's good that indie provides that space to tell those personal stories.
Yes, for sure, for sure. Yeah, I think that just like the independent aspect of it all, I guess companies to a certain extent, they have to make like games, and they have to do things for shareholders, or they have to do things for like, I don't know, like different reasons that are very complicated and business related, and I'm not gonna be able to go into in depth. But yeah, with indies, they don't necessarily have that pressure to kind of like make something that's supposed to be like a financial hit or something like that. They just kind of want to explore something.
Yeah, well, I think that's maybe a good place for us to go ahead and call this segment. So we're going to take a quick break, and when we get back, we're going to talk about writing monsters as people, because we both do a lot of that. So we'll be right back. Welcome back to Writers Are Fans. I'm joined once again with Chloe Spencer, and we're going to be talking about writing monsters as humans, because you're in sort of like the horror fiction space, but you also do a bit of like romancy fiction. Is that a fair way to describe what you do? And I think that in your case, you write things that we define as like literal monsters as like love interests, which I think is a thing that like may sound confusing to people that don't read the kind of things that you write typically. So I'll let you talk a little bit about this first, and then I'll talk about like my perspective as a fantasy writer.
Yeah, I think for me, the thing that interests me about writing with Monstersona, that one is one where the main character the main character Riley is in love with this girl named Aspen, who she doesn't know anything about really at the start of the book. And surprise surprise, Aspen is secretly a giant monster. And so when I was at LavenderCon, I think that when I was on the queer horrors panel, I sort of talked about how like a lot of that relationship was inspired by a relationship that I was in at the time, where we had both kind of dealt with like some different trauma in our pasts, and we were trying to learn how to navigate it. Um, and so I think that the idea with making Aspen like a monster, and I guess exploring like putting these love interests in like the place of monsters, which, or I guess monsters, haunting Melody, the love interest is a ghost. So I think that with me, I kind of like to use monsters as this way of kind of exploring disability, because Aspen has PTSD, and when she tends to feel triggered, or when she tends to feel like angry or sad or out of control or like unsafe, that's when her monster mode is kind of activated. And that's kind of how it felt like when I was kind of dealing with like the throes of PTSD, and like when I was first getting diagnosed, I would have like these random like kind of rage sessions and things like that, that would be very painful and like very overwhelming for me to deal with. It's just like a sensory overload kind of thing. And so when I wrote Monstersona, I wasn't diagnosed with PTSD at the time, but when through editing it, that's kind of when I really honed in on those aspects of like the monster as exploring like a form of disability, the monster as a form of like exploring otherness in that way. And then I think when it came to Haunting Melody was where the ghost is the love interest. That one was written after I was diagnosed and after I had been going through treatment with my therapist. And so I was able to kind of look at like the ghost, I think, from a different I was able to kind of look at the story from like a different perspective. But I think monsters have been used to kind of demonize the other, but in my work I kind of like to just historically speaking, like when it comes to films and things like that, like a lot of the times like we can think of monsters as like these queer coded characters and things like that. But I think with when it came to my work, I was interested in using the monster as almost like a way to humanize the human, to make that human seem like a little bit more relatable, to kind of ground that humans really like emotions and feelings a little bit more.
Yeah, I that really changes the way that I think about it. It opens my mind, I guess, to a different way of thinking about this, because in my book where I write fantasy, whenever I think about like fantasy races, I always go back to like the D&D Lord of the Rings mindset, Which the thing that I've always found problematic about that is like that there are some races that are inherently evil. That's just like who they are. Is they're just an evil people. And that's always struck me as like that feels unbelievable and strange and sort of terrible. So I'm always trying to write
Yeah,
like so like I have an orc main character in one of my books, and I do it because like first of all I think it's a good allegory for like race, because the idea of like being scared of somebody because of who they are isn't all that different from how we view like minorities in this country. um, but also I think that um, people are people, and I like to write people as people, even though they
mhm.
may be like stronger than a human or whatever, that doesn't mean that they're like inherently bad. So like I try to write them in that way too. But I think that it's interesting the way that you talk about it, where like it's a way to sort of like provide allegory for like things that we're going through. Like I think that's an interesting way to think about it, which is like, like sometimes it's hard to control your emotions for whatever. Maybe it's a mental health condition, maybe it's like something you're going through, maybe it's like chronic pain or something, and all those things could be things that the monster is experiencing. And if it's just part of, and something that I like to say a lot with my stuff is, I always feel like maybe people could say, "Hey, this dwarf or this orc is being somebody's being racist against this orc." Maybe for them it might resonate more than if it's like a black person, just because like they live in this world, and whenever they see people that look like people that live in this world, it might be harder for them to see. I feel like what you're doing is the same thing basically, but for like mental illness and things like that. That I think that um,
Yeah.
it's it's hard for people to accept that they exist sometimes, but if it's like a thing that is accepted in the world for that creature, then it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I also like love what you said about orcs about cuz like I always think that orcs are like the most like one of the most interesting fantasy races that exist, and yet like I always see them depicted, yeah, commonly see them depicted as villains, but I think that they're very like they're very cool, and I would love to see more stories about like orcs just like being people. I wrote like I remember writing like a little romance story about an orc like a long time ago, and I really loved that. And I really like how people like in your work specifically, you're like looking to kind of explore and sort of like challenge the kinds of stories that we're telling with monsters, like orcs and things like that, which I think is just so cool and so fun.
Well, I just think that, I don't think that when you think about monsters as people, like if you think about things that are monstrous races, or like things like you're writing, like ghosts and giant monsters or whatever. I think that when you think about those as like people, like it's not all that different than like what we go through, right? I mean, like I know people that are taller than me,
Yeah.
or stronger than me, or shorter than me, that are just sort of naturally that way. And I don't think that's all that different than like, an orc or like a gnome or whatever. It's just that physical differences that are just natural.
Yeah, I think with my works, I've only ever like used monsters to explore PTSD, which is something that I have. I think that it could be really interesting though to explore other like mental illnesses and disabilities through like the lens of monsters. I think that that could be, I think that it lends itself well. Because I think that the idea of a monster can be kind of scary and overwhelming, and in some days I really do feel like my PTSD can be considered a monster. It's something that's scary, it's something that's overwhelming, but it's something that's also at this point like, you know what, there's this kind of familiarity and almost like comfort that you can get from seeing monsters, I think. um when it comes to the familiarity, I think that we're always interested in something that scares us. Like there's a part of the human psyche that's very compelled to feel scared, or that like enjoys horror, that enjoys like scary things. And so in a way I kind of think that using that monster kind of can make that horror a little bit more accessible, and makes like communicating the idea of what it feels like to be a monster, what it feels like to have the mental illness, like a little bit more accessible. So like for Aspen, she deals with those rage attacks that she kind of gets as a result of PTSD. She deals with like flashbacks. She deals with a lot of anger, a lot of touch sensitivity kind of issues. And when she's triggered, she ends up going into this kind of monster mode. When she feels unsafe, she goes into this monster mode, and it's very hard for her at different points during the book to turn it off. Which kind of results in like Riley needing to make safety plans for her and like trying to navigate how she can keep Aspen safe while Aspen is kind of like mentally not in a space where she's able to like stop what she's doing and recognizing that what she's doing is kind of is not okay, is a little bit nuts. I think that there were things that I did when I was first diagnosed with PTSD where I was dealing with like some agoraphobia, and I remember dealing with like these instances where my head would just run and spiral for just hours, days. I like could not sleep at night. And it felt very much like I was not in control of my brain. I was just kind of like this my it felt like I was a passenger kind of in that car. And when I would get triggered, I kind of would blow up in ways where I felt almost like a monster, where I felt like I was just not in the right state of mind, where I wasn't in control, where I was something that was unrecognizable to myself. Um, and yeah, and I think that when it comes to Haunting Melody, that one is also, you can argue that the love interest in Haunting Melody has PTSD as well, because she's dead. Spoiler, she is dead. This is not a kind of, I know that there's some things where like, oh, the ghost is showing up because the ghost is in a coma. Like there's none of that in Haunting Melody. Like Cyrus is just having to navigate the world as a ghost. And being a ghost is challenging because things are not like super accessible for her. Things are not designed for her. There's this expectation that she should be using she should be using her powers to phase through walls and things like that, and she can't do that because she's so traumatized that she's not able to really get in touch with her powers. She's not able to kind of do those sorts of things. So she's forever changed by the actions of what someone did to her. She's forever changed by those actions and is forever having to like learn to navigate the world. She acts like a normal like human being. She just has like ghost powers. She's just got some differences that make her, not completely human. But she is still like learning to, I think, navigate with that kind of trauma.
Yeah, I really love that perspective because whenever I think about this character that I've written, and I've not done a lot with her yet, but like I plan to flesh her out. But she's a Japanese creature called a kitsune, which is like a fox demon kind of thing. But like
Oh, I love that. Yeah.
but like their stereotype is like they're like tricksters and they like pull pranks on people and they're kind of like little chaos monsters.
Hmm.
And the more I think about that as a person with ADHD, the more that it sounds like a lot of how we think of ADHD stereotypically. And the idea of
Yeah.
trying to fight your nature, as in like I want to I want to pull a prank right now, but I need to pay attention. So like how do I kind of like force myself to do that? Like that feels really compelling and also like very not dissimilar to my experience as a person with ADHD. Like how do I kind of like rein in my impulses to not change to the next thing immediately? And I feel like it's a really great way to think about like this monster stuff is like how can you pull something that is your experience or somebody or like some experience that resonates with you into these creatures, and I think that that's like a really smart way to think about it. So yeah, I really love the way that you sort of like framed this for your stories.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's I love what you talked about, like the kitsune and like the connection with ADHD, because I think that that's really interesting to kind of take the kitsune, who is, yeah, like as you know, like is historically known as that trickster, and then to kind of associate with like the compulsions that come with ADHD. I think that that's also like kind of a brilliant way to explore that as well. That's very cool. Yeah, I think that like monsters just in general like lend themselves well to being able to talk about like these very human qualities or characteristics or these things, without necessarily being so explicit about them, and kind of making it heavy and like uninteresting. as as can happen, I think, in like a contemporary like drama novel. Not saying that all contemporary drama novels are boring. I just think that like when you have the vehicle, so to speak, of the monster, there's a lot more things that you can communicate well to your audience about what it's like to, have PTSD, what it's like to have ADHD, while also still making it interesting and engaging, and kind of tying back to that sort of discussion of what it's like to live like that, what it's like to have that experience.
Yeah, it really makes me want to start like making a list of like different fantasy races and monsters and just like attaching like disorders to them. Like what is this a good allegory for? Because I feel like it is an interesting way to explore it, because I think that the unfortunate truth is that like if I just said this character has ADHD, people would be like, well, why are they forgetting stuff all the time? And it's like, well, that's what ADHD is. That's why that's why they're doing that. But I think that if you said a part of my species is that I forget things regularly, so I have to like make an extra effort to remind myself of things, then readers would be like, oh, that makes sense. That's just how that creature works. And it's just a funny like unfortunate truth about our reality, which is that people don't understand mental illness in a way that makes any real sense, right? Like people have ideas of
Yeah.
what they think PTSD or ADHD or OCD or whatever is that doesn't actually reflect the reality of it. And I think that whenever you put it through the lens of a monster, like people will be able to see like, oh, it makes sense to me that this monster has trouble with this thing. And then, you as an author then can
Right.
like pull the curtain back and be like, oh, but also this is true. This is the reality of
Yeah.
having this condition.
Yeah, I think that and I think that like with readers, they've really liked that kind of exploration. They've really liked kind of seeing it. Some people might say, well, you shouldn't put like mental illness in a bad light by representing it through a monster that's like misrepresenting it. And I'm like, how many stories have like we read or like grown up with, like such as the Iron Giant, for example, where the monster is like this misunderstood creature, like there's something maybe that's just like a little bit off about them, as like the Iron Giant. I trying to remember that story. I think that giant just like didn't understand necessarily its own strength, and didn't necessarily how to understand how to interact with like humans in a way that like made the humans feel safe. And I was just I think that like to look at a monster through the lens of like disability, I think can actually be a little bit more humanizing, and like give you a little bit more of a connection. And I think that when the book came out, when Monstersona came out in particular, there were a lot of people that were like, thanks for representing Aspen in the way that you did, because that's how I feel. Some days I just feel like a monster. I feel like I'm doing my absolute worst. And I was like, but then I also see the parts of the story where she's trying, and she's like trying to like fight back against this, or at least like learn how to live with it, and like learn to control her powers. And they were like, yeah, that is kind of how it feels like for me, at least. Like it's not a positive thing to it's not a positive thing to have PTSD. It like wrecks your life in like many, many ways. But yeah, just to see how it was like resonating with readers, I think was also pretty cool to see how they connected with the idea of the monster, but then they also like love the fact that like they could see the monster was being humanized at the same time throughout the story, as Aspen's learning how to control her powers.
Well, and not for nothing, but we think of mental illness as this like invisible disease or this invisible condition that we have, and I could see an appeal of it not being so invisible. Like if my ADHD symptoms were manifesting in a way that were like upsetting other people's lives, I wouldn't mind if little fox ears could sprout up in my head and people were like, "Oh, it's the ADHD. Okay, I understand what's happening now." So
Yeah,
I can understand why like the idea of
right.
like being
Like
a
they see me
ghost where you have to
breathing
wear the
fire.
trauma on your sleeve, like literally, like why that's like maybe not a terrible idea. It doesn't feel like the worst thing in the world, because it's like maybe people can see me now and see what I'm struggling with and not have to be, I don't have to try to navigate this without that.
Right. But yeah, I think that also just like tying into the monster like being like this great way to explore like disability or like, mental illness. I think that yeah, the monster is just this very easy visual representation of what that looks like. This very accessible representation of what that looks like. And so yeah, like the use of like the claws, or like the superpowers, like the fire breathing, or just the scales, like the kind of like fight or flight mode that comes with being a monster. I think that those things translate really well to the audience where they're like, oh, I get it. I like I'm wrapping my head around what that's like. Yeah.
Well, this has been a really great conversation. I'm leaving it feeling inspired. So that's always cool for me whenever I can leave these interviews feeling like more inspired than I did before. So if people wanted to learn more about you, read your books, find your games, those things, where should they go to find out more about you?
Yeah. So people can go to my website, which is chloespenceronline.com. And that's where you'll find like links to my work as a filmmaker. You'll also find like links to my game site, and basically all the titles that you can find under my name. I'm most active on social media on Instagram and TikTok at Hey It's Chloe Spencer. You can also find me on Twitter at Chloe Spencer Dev.
All right, so I'll do like a more thorough closing later. But thank you so much. This has been really, really great. I really have had a great time, and like I said, like my mind has been opened into ways to consider this that I haven't even like thought about before. So I really, really appreciate that. Most Writers Are Fans is a Starlight King production. Special thanks to our guest, Chloe Spencer. This episode of Most Writers Are Fans is edited by Andre Williamson. The intro video was designed by Ortinio. If you didn't know there was an intro video, Most Writers Are Fans has video episodes now. They can be found on YouTube and Spotify. If you'd like to support the podcast, please rate and review it. Also make sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you need to send a message or record a voice message, please visit the Spotify page for this show. Links for this and all additional information about Terry Bartley can be found on terrybartley.com. You can also email us at press@starlightkingpress.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, don't be afraid to tell your story.